Hi, everybody. I'm Monique Morton, Math Director for AdvanceKentucky, and this is office hours for AP Statistics. The AP Statistics exam is in 2 weeks, so I hope you are studying hard. I'm sure you're working hard with your AP teachers in preparation for the AP exam. I did get a couple of questions from Miss Gretchen Beard's class in North Hardin. Shout out to North Hardin High School. One of their questions was, what is your typical free response question on the AP Statistics exam? The short answer is there isn't really a typical question, but there are a couple of things that you can expect. One is that the free response questions, as you know, there are 5 short answer questions and the investigative task. One of those free response questions is most likely going to be some sort of hypothesis test that you have to complete from start to finish. A few years ago, it was a chi-square test, but generally it can be 1 sample, 2 sample, proportions, or means, but you will have to do a hypothesis test from start to finish. In fact, I'd guess about 1/3 of the questions over the last 6 years have had either a complete hypothesis test or some sort of significance test related to the question. Another part, a big chunk of it, almost as much as there are in statistical inference, was the part about anticipating patterns. That includes distributions and probability. There are a lot of anticipating patterns questions, more about distributions like sampling distributions, binomial distributions, and the like, than in random variables than there are straight up probability, but there's been a lot of them over the last 5 or 6 years. Less so have been questions about designing an experiment or planning a study and exploring data, although they do show up every year. So you know you're going to have a question where you have to deal with 1 variable data. There's going to be a question that's going to have some sort of plot in it. There'll probably be at least 1 of the 5 questions that talk a little bit about bias and random samples and that type of stuff. There'll be a lot of anticipating patterns, probability, and distributions, and there'll definitely be 1 full inference question and a sprinkling of inference throughout the test. So I hope that answers your question about the free response. Before we go on any further, I want to talk a little bit about the exam format. I'm sure you know it by now, but for those few people out there who haven't seen it, I'm going to talk a little bit about it. Let me take a moment and share my screen. So by now you know that the AP Statistics exam is 3 hours long. Section 1, multiple choice, is 90 minutes long. Section 2, free response, is also 90 minutes long. There are 40 multiple choice questions and 6 questions in free response, including the investigative task. Those 5 short answer questions, you should expect to answer them on average 12 minutes per question for a total of about 60 minutes. Investigative tasks, expect to spend at least twice as much time on it, let's say about 30 minutes, as any one of those 5 questions. These time links are suggestions. They're not hard and fast. No one's going to stop you at a 60-minute mark and say, go ahead and start the investigative task now. So you'll have to be able to manage your time. I suggest wearing a watch. You probably also know by now that each free response question has a score from 1 through 4. 4 meaning that it is complete. That doesn't mean that it's perfect, but it shows that you understand the material and you've demonstrated knowledge of the content in the question. 3 is substantial. There may be some minor mistakes in there, but overall you generally understand what's going on. Developing and minimal are what they sound like in a 2 or a 1 score. And even though I didn't put a 0 up here, it is possible to get a 0 if you write something that has nothing to do with the question or worse, is just completely wrong. In the exam scoring, the multiple choice section and the free response section are equally weighted. 50 points for multiple choice, 50 points for free response, that includes the investigative task. A total of 100 points possible. Up here you'll see the formula to figure all that out. But basically, section 1 and section 2 are equally weighted. A lot of times I get asked what are the cutoffs for getting a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The short answer to that is, I don't know. It depends on the year, because those cutoffs are not determined until after the AP exams. And the cutoffs aren't released every year, so there's that. But I will share with you the last set of cutoffs that I have, and that is from 2007. So you'll notice, first off, that it's not like getting graded on a test in class. You don't need 90% right to get a 5. In fact, in 2007, you could get as few as 37 out of the 100 points and still get a qualifying score of 3 or higher. So that's something to keep in mind. These ranges won't be the same for 2014, but they won't be that different either. It's not going to suddenly jump up to 95 to 100 to get a 5. So these are things to keep in mind as you're planning out and studying for your exams. So another question that I got from Mrs. Beard that she said her class wanted to know is how best to review or study for the exams. Well, you should already be doing that in class by now. At least I hope you all are. But in the time that remains, I'd suggest, if you don't already have one, buy a study guide that divides the class up into different sections. For each section, review the section and look especially at the stuff that you don't know how to do well. Concentrate your time in these last 2 weeks on the stuff that you don't know how to do well. If you already know how to do it, doesn't make sense to spend a whole lot of time studying that, right? Work through a lot of free response questions. Your teacher has a lot. I'm sure she's been working with you in class, for those of you in Ms. Beard's class, and I'm sure whomever your teacher is in the other class has been working with you with free response questions. Use those practices. If you get a good review book, make sure it's recent. Don't try to use something like from 1997 because it might not reflect what's currently in the syllabus. But if you use a recent review book, it'll probably have practice exams and practice questions in there also. Work through the questions knowing what they're going to look like on the AP exam. I'd also suggest having the formula sheet next to you so you can practice using it. The AP exam formula sheet looks a certain way, and it's not going to look exactly like the formulas in your textbook. So I suggest, if you haven't already done so, try to match what the formulas in the AP exam and what you know, so that you know what that formula sheet is going to look like. The formula sheet for the AP exam hasn't changed over the past few years, and you can find it easily on the collegeboard.com website. Practicing the good writing is important. Right? The AP exam for statistics is all about the communication in the context. As long as you're keeping your questions in context and you're writing full solutions, you should be okay. The most important thing to remember is communication and context. But I'm going to share with you a few more hints about writing free response questions. I'm going to go back and share my screen again. So, first important thing to remember when you're writing free response questions is to convince the reader that you understand the key concepts. You have to remember that you kind of have to step it up a little bit compared to what you write for your teachers, most likely. Your teachers know you, They might give you the benefit of the doubt and know what you mean, but the readers don't. They don't know you. They never met you. They probably think you're a delightful student because you're taking an AP statistics exam. But in order to convince the reader that you understand what's going on, you're going to have to write it down. There's no benefit of the doubt in terms of readers putting a score on a free response question. Single word answers is a no-no, right? Even if the question is put in such a way as yes or no by itself never gets full credit. So single word answers without a justification don't get credit. The same thing with numerical answers. If you are generating a numerical answer, let's say a standard deviation of a population or something, if you generate, well, maybe you wouldn't do that, but anyway, you get the idea. A numerical answer with no supporting work doesn't get any credit. So you have to give people an idea of where that number is coming from. That might be naming a test or writing a formula or anything that gives the folks an idea of what you did to get that number, if that number is something that you needed to calculate. Calculator syntax is insufficient. This doesn't happen so much because the way we put information in calculators has changed. But let's say you're doing a binomial distribution and you do something like binomial CDF and then a number and then another number and then another number, and that's what you write down there, and you say it's equal to some other number, but you've never put any labels on what you stuck in here. That's what we mean by insufficient. Binom CDF, this notation, is specific to a TI calculator. If somebody's using a different brand calculator, the syntax might be different. We don't know, we being the readers, don't know that you understand the statistics if you're just sticking numbers in calculator syntax. Use proper notation. Read all parts of a question before attempting to answer. If a question has several parts, read through the whole question. And if you find yourself in a place where you know how to do part B, but you're not quite sure for part A, on the AP statistics exam, it's okay to make some stuff up and do part B. Now, when I say make stuff up, don't be ridiculous. Don't create a negative number for a probability or something. But if you can make a reasonable number up and then move forward with the parts that you know how to do, you still have a shot at getting some credit. Other tips, stop writing when you've answered the question. I know that sounds obvious, but sometimes a student gets excited with how much they know, I guess. I don't really know why. But they'll keep writing more and more information, even though they answered the question a while ago. If the stuff you write is correct, this isn't a problem. But if the stuff that you're writing is wrong or contradictory stuff, it's going to bring your overall 4.321 score down. So keep it short, sweet, and to the point. I wrote context, context, context because every single question on the AP statistics exam, multiple choice and free response, is in a context. Therefore, every single answer that you provide has to be in a context. So when you write solutions to free response questions, you must write your answers or draw your conclusions in context. You won't get a 4 on any free response questions if the context is ignored. I mentioned this as quickly a second ago, but use standard symbols. This is a big deal, right? Mu, for example, is a population mean, while X bar is a sample mean. If you intended to talk about the population mean, but you wrote X bar, you're going to get dinged off for that. So make sure that you use proper standard symbols. Anytime you're using a symbol, make sure that it's the right one. The other thing you need to do is if you're making up symbols, like say you have 2 different samples In one sample, you're talking about the mean of males, and in another sample, you're talking about the mean of females. Don't assume that the reader knows what you're talking about, especially if I wrote M and F, that gave a hint. But what if you did X bar 1 and X bar 2? Anytime you make up your own symbols, be sure to define them for the reader. It goes a long way in making sure you communicate your point well. Use vocabulary carefully, especially words like normal and significant. Words like normal and significant have very specific meanings in statistics that are different than everyday use. A normal person and a normal distribution are not the same thing. So you have to be very careful with using your vocabulary. And I'd like to tell students to avoid using the pronoun it. It is 4.632 because it is between these two values. You have too many it's, not enough antecedents. It's very important that you communicate clearly what you mean. So even though it might mean writing a few more words, avoid the use of the pronoun it as much as you can. Skip the hard questions. What do I mean by that? If you're going through multiple choice or free response and you look at number 2 and you go, oh my gosh, I have no idea how to answer that question, skip it and go do something that you know how to do. This is true for both multiple choice and free response. There are 40 multiple choice questions. They are not in order of difficulty from easiest to hardest. You may find that you can do number 15, but you couldn't do number 10. I'd suggest in multiple choice, going through all 40 questions, do the ones that you know how to do first, skip anything you have a question about, and then go back as you have time and work on the other questions. Since there's no longer a penalty for guessing, you can guess at the stuff for which you have no idea. But it makes more sense to be able to eliminate more than one answer if you can when answering multiple choice. Stay the same course when you're doing free response questions. If you don't understand how to do number 2, if you're clueless, go on and look at numbers 3, 4, 5, and 6. Do whatever parts you know how to do well first, and then go back and fill in the things that are questionable and make a good run at some other things. Sometimes working on something else will give you a hint on how to do the problem that you thought you didn't know how to do. Don't forget about the investigative task. Just because it's number 6 doesn't mean it necessarily has to be last. I know a lot of AP statistics teachers who recommend to students to work for about 30 minutes on the first 5 short answer free response questions, and then in the middle go work on the investigative task for a while, and then go back and work on the remaining questions. That's just advice to get students to not forget about the investigative task. The investigative task is worth twice as much as any one free response question of the first 5. So you need to make sure that you leave time for it and that you spend a good chunk of time to it. Even if you have to go start it, come back, start it and come back, whatever works for you, but don't forget to spend some time on it. Provide only one answer to a question. Sometimes you're not sure whether it's this test or that test. If you're doing a hypothesis test, you're not sure whether it's supposed to be a matched pair or something else, blocking maybe, and so you work it out both ways. Don't do that. First of all, one of them is going to clearly be wrong. And if the reader can't decide which one is your answer, they're just going to average the 2 scores and round down. Since you don't want that to happen, just put one answer down there. If you started off the problem and then realize that you're headed down a wrong path, just cross it out or erase it. The readers don't read anything that's crossed out, and they don't read anything that's been erased. So I think crossing out is more time efficient, but cross out or erase any incorrect, incomplete, oh my gosh, I started out this problem wrong, I should change it answer. And finally, don't forget to write neatly and clearly, right? The readers are real people. They are teachers of AP statistics in high school, as well as college teachers, and they need to be able to read your answer in order to give you full credit for it. There are a lot of words on the AP statistics exam, as I'm sure you know by now. And as you write your free response questions, you want people to understand what you're writing. So some of us have challenging handwriting. I know I do. You have to practice writing things a little clearer for the benefit of the reader. A reader who understands what's going on is much more likely to find the points that are on the paper. So since there's so much inference on the exam, I wanted to take a few minutes and talk a little bit about confidence intervals and hypothesis testing. And I wanted to start with confidence intervals. So I'm going to go back and share my screen again. For confidence interval problems, once you determine that it is a confidence interval problem, and that's usually pretty easy because it'll say something like with 95% confidence, that's a dead ringer for it's going to be a confidence interval problem. Make sure you're identifying which confidence test, means, proportion, 1 sample, 2 sample, which confidence interval that you're going to do. Don't forget to state and verify the conditions. It's important that you actually state what the conditions are, independence, for example, normality, and actually check that they're working. Carry out the computations. You can use your calculator or you can use formulas from the table. And finally, interpret it in context. Always go back to the context. This is very, very important. So this problem that I'm about to show you is an example. I don't know if you can read it. That type might be a little small, so I'll read it to you. From the year 2008, it was from the Form B exam, and it's number 3. A car manufacturer is interested in conducting a study to estimate the mean stopping distance for a new type of brakes when the car is traveling at 60 miles per hour. These new brakes will be installed on cars of the same model, and the stopping distance will be observed. The cost of each observation is $100. A budget of $12,000 is available to conduct the study, and the goal is to carry it out in the most economic way. Preliminary study indicates that sigma equals 12 feet for stopping distances. Part A, and there was a part A and a part B in this question, are sufficient funds available to estimate the mean stopping distance to within 2 feet of the true mean stopping distance with 95% confidence? Explain your answer. So here's my hint, big as it is, that I'm dealing with a confidence interval. But notice that this question does not ask me to find a 95% confidence interval. In fact, it wants to know, do I have sufficient funds? Well, my budget is $12,000 and each observation is $100. So what I want to know is, do I have 120 or less observations? In other words, what's in? So let's think about how the formula sheet on the AP exam talks about confidence intervals. It basically says, so you take the statistic plus or minus the critical value times the standard deviation of the statistic to get a confidence interval. Now, since our statistic is the mean stopping distance, then, and we have a 95% confidence interval, our critical value is going to be 1.96, right? That's our Z star for a 95% confidence interval. And our standard deviation is going to be found by taking sigma and dividing that by the square root of n. So this is 12 divided by the square root of n. Now, we don't know what the mean is, but we do know how wide we want that confidence interval to be. We want that confidence interval to be 2 feet wide. We want it to be within 2 feet of the true mean. So in other words, we want 2 to be equal to the critical value times the standard deviation of the statistic. So notice that this is actually going back to the formula. Using my calculator's confidence interval button doesn't help me here. I have to know how to solve this equation on my calculator, and I've already solved it. N comes out to be 138.298 if I solve that equation. So what I'm going to need is 139 observations. Well, 139 observations is too many, right? That's going to cost $13,900 because it costs $100 for each observation. So the answer to the question is no. And here is my justification. Because I'm going to need, I don't really have enough room to write it the way I would want to write it on the exam, but I'm going to need 139 observation at $100 per observation. That costs $13,900, which exceeds my available budget of $12,000 or something to that effect. Part B of this question asked, so a regulatory agency requires a 95% level of confidence for an estimate of mean stopping distance that is within 2 feet, and the car manufacturer can't exceed the budget of $12,000. Discuss the consequences. Well, here's the thing. The manufacturer would need 139 observations to comply with the regulatory agency. But they have a budget for only, oops. Sorry, I lost my page, just a second. But they have a budget for, well, I keep moving my thing, so I'm going to stop moving it now. Wait, I've got it. They have a budget for only 120 cars. That means that the manufacturer cannot comply with the regulatory agency's constraints. I don't have enough room here to write out my whole answer, but you get the idea. So notice that when I answered part B, I referred back to my answer in part A. That 139 observations was what I found in part A. And that 139 observations would cost $13,900. But I only have a budget for 120 cars that cost $12,000. There's no way with this budget that I can meet the regulatory agency's requirement. This is some of the importance of statistics. Right? Statistics always requires some context. And this is a problem that could be upping the value of what you have to spend. something that happens in the real world, much more simplified problem than a real world problem, I would suggest. But it is something that would go along with it. So even though this is the confidence interval problem, it's an inference problem, you didn't have to find the confidence interval. You actually kind of went backwards to determine what population was necessary in order to live within the budget constraints of the problem. I want to take a while also to look at one more thing. And the thing that I want to look at now is actually a hypothesis test. So get my screen share on just a second. Here we go. So when you're doing a hypothesis or a significance test, again, this has 4 parts. The first part is state the hypotheses. Hypotheses testing, seems like there should be hypotheses there. It makes sense to me. Then you need to identify the test and state and verify the conditions. Thirdly, you need to calculate this test statistic and the p-value, and then state the conclusion in context. These 4 steps are also how they score a hypothesis test. They're going to be looking for these 4 parts, and they're going to rank them. As you know, probably from your statistics teachers, they're usually ranked E, P, or I, with E being exceeds expectations, and P being, oh, I forgot what E, P, and I stand for. But anyway, I is incomplete or insufficient, and P is partially correct, essentially correct, partially correct, and incorrect. There, I got it. Anyway, these are the 4 parts that they're going to be ranking in a typical hypothesis test question. So if you look at a typical hypothesis test question, and this is one, this is from 2010, the AP Statistics exam 2010. Here, you've got 2 different types of, 2 different pet stores. The large pet store buys identical species of adult tropical fish from 2 different suppliers, Buy Right Pets and Fish Friends. Several of the managers at the pet store suspect that the lengths of the fish from Fish Friends are consistently greater than the lengths of the fish from Buy Right Pets. Random samples of 8 adult fish of the species from Buy Right Pets and 10 adult fish of the same species from Fish Friends were selected, and the lengths of the fish in inches were recorded as shown in the table below. So they show you the data, they give you the mean and standard deviation of each sample. So you have 2 samples and you're calculating the mean and standard deviation. That should give you a big hint into what type of test you need to be doing. Now, how do I know I need to do a hypothesis test? I'm going to look for something that says, do the data provide convincing evidence? If I see that, especially if I don't see any other parts to the question, that's a big hint that I need to do a hypothesis test. Now, since there are means and there are 2 samples, it looks like I'm going to do a 2-sample t-test just off the top of my head. Rather than actually do the test this time, I actually just copied a student solution that was used as an example online, and I'm going to share that with you right now. So here, right there, the student has said, I'm going to conduct a 2-sample t-test to estimate the true mean and difference in fish lengths. So they've already told me what type of test they're going to do. I noticed that right in here, I see the null and alternative hypotheses. They have defined the variables for me. So they were very careful. Mu sub F is the true mean length of fish as Fish Friends. Mu sub B is the mean length of fish at Buy Right Pets. So for no difference, mu F minus mu B equals 0, or the difference is positive, and they've decided on an alpha level of 0.05. you weren't given an alpha level in this problem, so but it's pretty common to use alpha equals 0.05 when you don't have one. So that's what that student did. So this student has already taken care of the hypotheses part of the hypotheses testing. Here, they've done a good job of labeling. They've tested the conditions. First, groups of fish are independently and randomly selected. You were told that in the problem. We can assume that both samples are less than 10% of the population of each fish store. That statement alone doesn't do it. But the fact they said at least 80 at buy right and at least 200 fish at Fish Friends now talks about, now you're multiplying you have at least 80 fish greater than that 10%, right? You have at least 80 fish at the buy right store, and you probably have at least 100 fish at the Fish Friend store. Number 3, they've decided to justify the distributions as normal by using box plots, although they said they drew box plots and talked about histograms. There's no contradiction in what they've said here, so we're going to be okay with it. There's no apparent outliers or drastic skewedness, so we're going to assume that both distributions are normal. I'd probably do a normal distribution plot and show that it's linear as a way of testing normality, but you can do box and whisker plots or histograms to show it as well. Remember to do it for both samples, buy right pets and fish prints. Well, the student has shown that all these conditions are met. And so in this last part down here, well, not last part, in this part right here, they've done the mechanics. They've actually shown the calculation of the t-value by plugging the values into the formula for t, found the probability, told us what the degrees of freedom are, and then drew a picture. I'm a big fan of drawing pictures, right? Even though I use my calculator for the most part to generate this information, I always draw it labeled a picture. It gives a good idea for what the work is that I'm doing, right? And it also helps me if I shade it as to whether that p-value is going to be greater than or smaller than that actual alpha that I've chosen. So here are the calculations. Here are the conditions. Here's the hypothesis. They've named the test. So down here, I'm looking at the student's conclusion. With a p-value greater than alpha, we fail to reject the null and cannot conclude that the mean length of fish from Fish Friends is greater than the mean length of fish for buy right pets. Notice that they didn't stop here with fail to reject the null. They kept going and brought in the context of the problem. This is very important. It's also important that you connect your conclusion with your p-value. It's very important that you mention that. Because my p-value is relatively large, because my p-value is greater than an alpha of 0.05, we fail to reject the null and therefore cannot conclude ... By the way, this student got a 4. I think it's pretty clear why this student got a 4. They did a really good job of writing out their solution. Well, that's it for my presentation today. If I have to give any more advice in getting ready for the AP Stat exam, it's this. Check your calculator batteries early. Check them at least 2 days before the actual test. That way, if you need new batteries, you can get them and you can play around with your calculator to make sure that everything works. If you need to download anything else from your calculator because you accidentally erase stuff, that kind of thing. If you're using a calculator that is bought within the last 2 or 3 years, there should be no need to add any programs to your calculator in order to do what you should be able to do for the exam. All of the functions are built in. If you're using TI-83s or 4s, TI-89s, all of those Inspires, all of those calculators are up to date enough that you would not need to upgrade them in any way in order to use them for your AP Stat exam. Since there's so much writing, you have to understand that the AP Statistics exam is emphasizing communication over calculation. If you make a minor mistake because you rounded something one way or the other, too high or too low, but all of the writing is done well and everything is in context and it's clear which formulas you're using or what tests you're doing, you're probably likely to get a 4 on that, even though your mechanics are not perfect. Keep that in mind when you're working through the problems. Finally, the night before the exam, don't cram. If you haven't learned it in 9 months, you're not going to learn it in 9 hours. I'm sorry to tell you that. So don't try to learn all in your AP Statistics class the night before the exam. In fact, go to bed at a reasonable hour. Get a good night's sleep. Wake up in the morning, eat breakfast. Make sure you have a balanced breakfast, not a lot of sugar. Keep a power bar in your pocket and make sure that you're mentally prepared for the AP Statistics exam. I had a student a few years back who completely psyched themselves out. They had been doing well in class all year long, but for some reason got completely nervous the day of the AP exam and just blew it because of nerves. Calm down. You know this stuff by now. Your teachers have been working with you all year. You've been going to the study sessions. You've been practicing and doing your homework, right? If you've been doing everything you're supposed to do, and there's no reason for you not to do well on the exam. If you still have questions for me, I invite you to tweet me using the hashtag AskMoniqueKY, and if I can, I'll still answer your questions. I'm only going to do one of these hangouts for the general public. If you know someone who couldn't watch it and they want to watch it later, they can do so just by using the same YouTube link. Once I cut off this broadcast, this will be recorded so you can watch it back, or somebody else can watch it back if you'd like. Before I go off the air, a couple of reminders. On Thursday, April 30th, is the AP English Language Hangout, which will start at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 7:30 Central. And Sunday, May 3rd, is the AP Bio Hangout. So if you're taking AP Biology and you want to have some questions on his office hours, that's Sunday, May 3rd, 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, 6 p.m. Central. I'm Monique Morton, Math Director for AdvanceKentucky. I hope you found this helpful. I'll see you later. Bye-bye.